Eleanor Whitmore's hands trembled as her sister Charlotte gripped her wrist so tightly it hurt. "Do it," Charlotte whispered, her voice sharp with a cruel kind of delight. "Or admit in front of everyone that you are too much of a coward to even try." Around them, the ballroom glittered with candlelight and laughter, but none of it reached Eleanor. Her eyes were fixed on the man seated alone at the far end of the supper table, his dark coat cutting a severe line against the pale silk and lace of every other guest in the room. Julian Ashcombe, the Duke of Ashcombe, sat like a storm that had wandered indoors by mistake. No one approached him. No one dared. "He will not even look at you," said Margaret, the eldest of the three sisters, fanning herself with lazy cruelty. "But that is rather the point, is it not? We simply want to see you try." Louisa, the youngest and the sharpest-tongued of them all, laughed behind her gloved hand. "Sit beside him, Eleanor, just for one course. If you can manage that without fainting, we shall never call you dull again." Eleanor looked at the three of them, each one dressed finer than the last, each one certain that she would fail. She was used to being the sister no one noticed, the one whose gowns were remade from Margaret's old ones, the one who stood at the edge of every room while her sisters were pulled into its center. Tonight, something in her chest refused to bend the way it usually did. "Very well," she said quietly, "I will do it." Charlotte's smile faltered, as if she had not expected agreement. "You cannot be serious. I said I would do it." Eleanor straightened her spine, smoothed the front of her plain blue gown, and walked toward the supper table before her courage could abandon her. The room seemed to grow louder and quieter at once, the way a space does when many people are trying very hard not to stare while staring completely. Whispers followed her like a current pulling at her skirts. She kept her eyes forward, on the empty chair beside the Duke, and did not let herself look back at her sisters, who she knew were watching with barely hidden glee, certain this would end in her humiliation. She reached the chair. Her fingers found the back of it, cool and solid beneath her gloves. For one breath, she considered turning around. Nearby, an older gentleman glanced up from his plate and gave a small, disbelieving shake of his head, as though warning her away without saying a word. A young woman across the table pressed her napkin to her mouth to hide a gasp. Eleanor felt the weight of every unspoken warning pressing against her back, urging her to retreat before she made a fool of herself in front of the entire room. But then she thought of her sister's laughter, of years spent being told she was too plain, too quiet, too easily forgotten, of the countless evenings she had watched from the edges while dances and conversations swirled around everyone but her. She thought of how tired she was of shrinking herself to fit into the small space her family had always allowed her, and she pulled the chair back and sat down. Julian Ashcombe turned his head. His eyes were a deep, unreadable gray, and for a moment they studied her with an intensity that made her want to look away. She did not. She held his gaze, chin lifted, refusing to let him see how loudly her heart was beating. "You are sitting in the chair no one else in this room would dare to sit in," he said. His voice was low, even, without the coldness she had expected from a man so widely feared. "So I have been told," Eleanor replied, surprised at how steady her own voice sounded. "And why is that?" She considered lying, considered inventing some polite excuse about the crowded table or the warmth of the room. Instead, she found herself telling the truth. "My sisters dared me to sit beside you. They believed I would not have the nerve." Something shifted in his expression, not quite a smile, but close to one. "And did you believe them?" "I did not know," Eleanor admitted, "but I did not wish to spend another evening proving them right." For a long moment he said nothing, only watched her with those gray eyes, as though she were a puzzle he had not expected to find at a crowded supper table. Then he reached for the wine decanter and filled her glass before his own, a small gesture that made the older woman across the table blink in visible surprise. "Most people who find themselves near me," he said, "either flatter me or flee from me. You have done neither." "Should I be flattering you, Your Grace?" "No," he said. "I find I am rather tired of flattery." They spoke through the rest of the course, and Eleanor found, to her own astonishment, that conversation with him came easily. He asked her questions no one else at these events ever bothered to ask, about the books she read, about whether she preferred the quiet of the countryside to the noise of the city, about what she thought of the newest opera everyone else pretended to understand but privately found tedious. She answered honestly, and he listened as though her answers mattered, which no one had done in a very long time. At one point she mentioned, almost without thinking, how much she loved walking early in the morning before the rest of the house woke, when the gardens were still quiet and the light was soft and gray. Julian went still for a moment, studying her with an expression she could not quite name. "I walk at that hour as well," he said. I had begun to think I was the only person in London who valued that kind of silence. Perhaps we have simply never crossed paths at the right hour, Eleanor said, and immediately wondered if she had spoken too boldly. But Julian only nodded slowly, as though filing the thought away somewhere he intended to return to. He did not ask about her family's fortune, or lack of it, nor did he inquire after her prospects the way other gentlemen sometimes did when circumstance forced them into conversation with her. He simply spoke to her as though she were a person worth knowing, and that alone felt like more than Eleanor had received from most of society in all her 20 years. Across the ballroom, Eleanor's sisters watched with expressions that shifted from smug anticipation to something closer to alarm. Charlotte's fan had gone still in her hand. Margaret leaned toward Louisa and murmured something behind her glass. Her eyes narrowed on the supper table where the Duke had angled his entire body toward Eleanor, as though the rest of the room had ceased to exist. "He is only being polite," Louisa said, though her voice lacked conviction. "It means nothing." But it did not look like politeness to anyone else watching. The Duke of Ashcombe, known throughout the ton for his clipped words and his refusal to dance more than once at any event, was laughing quietly at something the overlooked Whitmore sister had said. Heads turned. Fans stopped mid-motion. A hush moved through the nearby tables like a ripple across still water. When the final course was cleared and guests began to rise for dancing, Julian stood and offered Eleanor his hand before she had even decided whether to remain seated. "Would you do me the honor of a dance?" Eleanor hesitated, aware of every eye in the room now turned toward them. "Your Grace, I do not think. I am not asking because it is expected of me," he said, quietly enough that only she could hear. "I am asking because I would like to dance with you." There was something in the plainness of his words that undid her hesitation entirely. She placed her gloved hand in his and let him lead her to the floor, where the other dancers parted around them with poorly disguised curiosity. His hand at her waist was steady, his steps sure, and for the length of the dance, Eleanor forgot entirely about the dare that had brought her here. She forgot, that is, until she caught sight of her sisters near the refreshment table, no longer laughing, their faces tight with something that looked remarkably like fear. It was the first time in Eleanor's life she had ever seen them look at her that way. When the dance ended, Julian walked her back toward her family rather than simply releasing her into the crowd, a courtesy that seemed to unsettle her sisters even further. He bowed over her hand. "I hope I might have the pleasure of your company again, Miss Whitmore." "I hope so too, Your Grace," Eleanor said, and meant it. He inclined his head toward her sisters, a brief and correct acknowledgement that nonetheless made all three of them straighten as though struck. Then he turned and walked back through the crowd, which parted before him the way it always had, though tonight there seemed to be new murmurs following in his wake, murmurs that included Eleanor's name. The moment he was out of earshot, Charlotte rounded on her. "What did you say to him?" "Nothing you would find interesting," Eleanor said, and was surprised at how calm she felt. "He danced with you," Margaret said, as though the fact still had not settled properly in her mind. "He never dances." "Perhaps he simply had not met the right partner before," Eleanor said. Louisa's eyes narrowed, sharp and assessing in a way that made Eleanor's satisfaction cool slightly. "Do not grow too pleased with yourself, sister. A duke's attention at one supper means nothing. Men like that grow bored quickly." Eleanor said nothing to that, though privately she wondered if Louisa was right. She had grown up believing herself unremarkable, had spent years watching her sisters receive the attention she was told she did not deserve. It would be foolish to imagine that one evening, one dance, had changed anything real about her place in the world. And yet, as their carriage rolled home through the dark streets, Eleanor found herself replaying every word Julian Ashcombe had spoken to her, the way he had listened as though she mattered, the way his eyes had not once drifted toward the more beautiful women filling the room. She pressed her gloved hand against the window glass and watched the city lights blur past, and for the first time in years, she allowed herself to hope that perhaps she was not as invisible as her family had always insisted. Her sisters sat across from her in tense silence, none of them speaking, none of them laughing now at the dare they had thrown at her like a stone meant to sink her. Whatever they had expected from tonight, it had not been this. At home, as the sisters climbed the stairs toward their rooms, Charlotte paused at the top and looked back at Eleanor with an expression that was not quite anger, and not quite worry, but something uneasy caught between the two. "Be careful, Eleanor," she said. "Men like the Duke do not simply fall for a girl because she managed to sit beside him once." "I am not falling for anything," Eleanor said. "I only sat where I was dared to sit." But even as she said it, she was not entirely certain it was true. Something had shifted tonight, quietly and without warning, the way the tide turns before anyone notices the water has changed direction. Eleanor closed her bedroom door behind her, sat at her small writing desk, and stared at her own reflection in the dark window glass, wondering what exactly she had begun. By morning, all of London seemed to know that the Duke of Ashcombe had danced with Eleanor Whitmore. She learned this at breakfast, when her mother swept into the dining room with a folded letter clutched in one hand, and an expression Eleanor had never seen directed at her before, something caught between astonishment and calculation. Lady Pemberton writes that you are the talk of 3 separate drawing rooms this morning, her mother said, setting the letter beside Eleanor's plate as though it were evidence in a trial. The talk, Eleanor. You. Charlotte, seated across the table, did not look up from her tea. I am certain it will pass by tomorrow. It had better not pass, their mother said sharply. Not if it means what I hope it means. Eleanor said nothing, though her stomach turned with a mixture of pleasure and unease. She had not expected one dance to travel so far, so quickly, through rooms she had never even entered. She thought of Julian's steady gray eyes, the low, even sound of his voice, and felt something warm settle beneath her ribs, quickly followed by doubt. Perhaps Louisa had been right. Perhaps it meant nothing at all, and she was foolish to feel anything about it. Her father entered the room a moment later, still in his morning coat, and paused when he saw the letter resting beside Eleanor's plate. He read it without asking permission, a habit Eleanor had long since stopped protesting, and his expression shifted as he did, from mild curiosity to something more focused and calculating. The Duke of Ashcombe, he said slowly, as though testing the weight of the name in his mouth. That is no small thing, Eleanor. It was only a dance, father. Dukes do not dance twice with women who mean nothing to them, and they certainly do not dance once with a woman society has never bothered to notice, unless something about her has caught their attention. He folded the letter carefully, as though it were something valuable, and set it down again. You would do well to encourage this. Eleanor felt a flicker of unease at the eagerness in his voice, though she could not yet name why it troubled her. She told herself it was simply a father's natural hope for his daughter's happiness, nothing more sinister than that, and pushed the feeling aside as she finished her tea. That doubt did not last long. 2 days later, an invitation arrived at the Whitmore house addressed specifically to Eleanor, requesting her presence at a small musical evening hosted by the Duke of Ashcombe's aunt, Lady Constance Ashcombe. Eleanor read the card twice before she believed it was real. He is asking after you specifically, her mother said, turning the card over as if searching for a hidden explanation. Not the family, you. Perhaps his aunt simply enjoys music and wished to be generous, Eleanor said, though she did not entirely believe it herself. Margaret's mouth had gone tight and thin. Dukes do not send private invitations to girls they danced with once out of generosity. The evening of the musical gathering, Eleanor dressed with more care than she had allowed herself in years, though her gown remained simple, a soft gray silk that had once belonged to Margaret and had been altered to fit her narrower frame. She arrived at the Ashcombe townhouse with her heart pounding harder than she wanted to admit, uncertain what kind of reception she might find. Lady Constance turned out to be a small, sharp-eyed woman well into her 60s, with silver hair pinned in an elegant knot, and a manner of speaking that suggested she had spent decades deciding exactly what she thought of people within moments of meeting them. So you are Miss Whitmore, Lady Constance said, studying Eleanor with unhurried thoroughness. My nephew has mentioned you twice in 1 week, which is roughly twice as often as he mentions anyone. I hope that is a good sign, my lady, Eleanor said. It is an unusual one at the very least. Lady Constance's mouth curved into something that might have been the beginning of approval. Come, sit near me. I find these evenings tedious without someone sensible to talk to. Eleanor took the seat offered to her, aware of a few curious glances from other guests scattered through the room, women who clearly recognized her now as the young lady who had captured the Duke's attention at that first supper. She kept her chin level and her hands folded calmly in her lap, refusing to let their curiosity unsettle her the way it might have only weeks earlier. Tell me, Miss Whitmore, Lady Constance said, studying her with the same unhurried thoroughness as before. What do you make of my nephew's reputation? I am certain you have heard a great deal of it by now. Eleanor chose her words carefully. I have heard that he is difficult to know. That is a diplomatic answer. Lady Constance's sharp eyes glinted with something like amusement. Most young women either repeat the gossip outright, calling him cold or cruel, or they flatter him shamelessly in hopes I will repeat their praise to him later. You have done neither. I do not know him well enough yet to judge him either way, my lady. Good, Lady Constance said with evident satisfaction. That is precisely the correct answer. Julian has had quite enough of people deciding who he is before they have bothered to learn anything true about him. There was a weight behind the words that suggested old grief, old wounds Eleanor did not yet fully understand, and she found herself curious, not in the idle way of gossip, but in a manner that felt closer to genuine care. Julian arrived shortly after, and something in his expression eased visibly when he saw Eleanor already seated beside his aunt, the two of them deep in conversation about a novel Lady Constance had recently and loudly declared to be nonsense from the first page. He crossed the room to join them, and for the length of the musical performance that followed, Eleanor found herself acutely aware of him seated just beside her, close enough that she could feel the warmth of him even without their arms touching. "You have made an impression," he said quietly, during a pause between pieces. "My aunt does not warm to people easily. She seems very direct. She is the only person who speaks to me honestly anymore," Julian said, and something in his tone made Eleanor glance at him more closely. "Most people who come near me want something. A connection, an introduction, a favor. It becomes difficult to know who values you and who values what you can give them." Eleanor considered this carefully before answering. "That sounds like a lonely way to live." "It is," he said simply, and did not elaborate further, though the honesty of the admission settled somewhere in Eleanor's chest and stayed there for the rest of the evening. Before she left, Julian asked if he might call on her the following week, a request so direct and so clearly deliberate that Eleanor found herself agreeing, before she had fully considered what it might mean for her standing, her family, her future. She only knew that she wanted to see him again, wanted to sit across from him and hear him speak plainly the way almost no one else in her life ever did. The following days brought a shift in the Whitmore household that Eleanor had never experienced before. Her mother began speaking to her with a new, careful attentiveness. Her father, usually distant and preoccupied, asked pointed questions about her conversations with the Duke, questions that felt less like fatherly interest and more like calculation. Only her sisters remained largely unchanged, though their unkindness had taken on a sharper, more anxious edge. "You cannot possibly believe this will last," Margaret said one evening, as the sisters sat together in the drawing room while their mother entertained visitors downstairs. "Men like the Duke marry for connections, for fortune, for beauty that photographs well in a portrait. You have none of those things to offer him." "Perhaps he wants something else," Eleanor said quietly. Louisa laughed, a short, disbelieving sound. "There is nothing else that men like that want, sister. You are a novelty to him, a curiosity. It will not last past the season." Eleanor did not argue, though the words lodged themselves uncomfortably beneath her skin, returning to her in quiet moments over the following days, whispering doubts she had not asked for and did not want. She told herself her sisters spoke from jealousy, from a lifetime of being the ones admired while she stood at the edges. But some small, frightened part of her wondered if they might be right. Charlotte, who had said little during the exchange, finally set down her needlework and looked at Eleanor with an expression that was almost, though not quite, kind. "I do not say this to be cruel, Eleanor. I say it because I do not wish to see you hurt when it ends. Men of his standing do not choose wives the way ordinary men do. There are expectations placed on him, connections his family will insist upon, a fortune that must be protected. A dance and a garden walk do not undo generations of that kind of thinking." "Perhaps not," Eleanor said, "but I would rather risk being hurt by something real than spend my life protecting myself from every possibility of feeling anything at all." Margaret looked at her for a long moment, something unreadable passing behind her eyes, before she returned her attention to the letter she had been writing, and said nothing further. Eleanor left the room feeling both wounded and strangely resolved, as though her sister's warnings, however sharp, had only clarified how much she wanted to see where this new connection might lead. When Julian called the following week, he arrived not with flowers or empty compliments, but with a worn, leather-bound book of poetry he thought she might enjoy, having remembered, from one brief conversation, the kind of writing she had mentioned preferring. It was such a small thing, and yet it undid every doubt her sisters had planted more thoroughly than any grand gesture could have managed. They walked together in the small garden behind the Whitmore house, trailed at a respectful distance by Eleanor's maid, and spoke of ordinary things, the weather, the tedium of certain social obligations, the strange comfort of quiet mornings. It was in the middle of an unremarkable sentence about the roses along the garden wall that Julian stopped walking and turned to face her fully. "I have a reputation in this city," he said, without preamble. "I imagine you have heard some version of it. Cold, unkind, difficult." "I have heard those words," Eleanor admitted. "Do you believe them?" She considered the question seriously, the way she suspected he wanted her to. "I believe you are careful. I do not think carefulness and cruelty are the same thing, though I understand why people might confuse them from a distance." Something shifted in his face, a loosening around his eyes that she had not seen before. "You are the first person in a very long time who has bothered to make that distinction. Perhaps others have simply not looked closely enough. Or perhaps," he said, "I have not given many people the chance to look." They stood together in the quiet garden, the late afternoon light turning gold around them, and Eleanor felt something settle between them that she did not yet have the words for, something steadier and more real than the excitement of that first dance. It did not feel like a curiosity that would fade by season's end. It felt like the beginning of something neither of them had quite expected to find. But even as she allowed herself that hope, a small, cold unease remained lodged beneath it. Her family's shifting attention, her sister's sharpening resentment, her father's calculating questions, all of it pressed at the edges of this fragile new happiness, and Eleanor could not entirely silence the feeling that trouble, when it came, would not come from strangers or society at large. It would come from within her own house. That evening, as she prepared for bed, Eleanor overheard her father's voice through the thin wall separating her room from his study, low and urgent, speaking with her mother about debts she had never been told existed, about creditors growing impatient, about the value of a fortunate connection to a wealthy title. She stood very still in the dark hallway, one hand pressed against the wall, and understood, with a sinking clarity, that her budding connection to Julian Ashcombe had become something far more complicated than a simple matter of the heart. To her family, it had become a solution to a problem she had not known they carried, and she feared, even as she climbed into bed and stared at the ceiling long after the candle had been snuffed out, that this knowledge would change everything that came next, whether she wished it to or not. She thought back over the small kindnesses of the evening, the worn book of poetry, the honesty in Julian's admission about carefulness and cruelty, the way he had stood in the garden and looked at her as though she were someone worth truly seeing. None of it had felt calculated or false. And yet now, lying awake with her father's urgent voice still echoing faintly in her memory, Eleanor could not help wondering how much of what came next would be shaped by feeling, and how much would be shaped by the quiet, desperate arithmetic of debts she had never been told existed. She resolved, before sleep finally took her, that whatever happened between herself and Julian would happen honestly, on her own terms, regardless of what her family hoped to gain from it. She only hoped that resolve would prove strong enough to withstand whatever pressure was still to come. The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning, tucked among the usual correspondence, and it very nearly ended everything before it had properly begun. Eleanor did not see it first. Julian did, delivered to his townhouse by an unmarked messenger, sealed with no signature, and written in a careful, deliberately disguised hand. It claimed that Eleanor Whitmore had been secretly corresponding with another suitor for months, a gentleman of lesser standing whom her family had hoped to match her with before the Duke's attention changed their calculations, and that her sudden interest in Julian was nothing more than a calculated abandonment of a prior arrangement, timed to secure herself the better prospect. Julian read it twice in his study, the fire burning low beside him, and felt something cold settle in his chest that he recognized immediately and hated. It was the old, familiar suspicion, the one that had calcified in him years ago after a broken engagement had taught him precisely how easily affection could be manufactured for the sake of advantage. He had believed, foolishly perhaps, that Eleanor was different. Now a single anonymous letter had reopened a wound he thought long since closed. He did not confront her immediately. Instead, he spent 2 days in careful silence, declining an invitation to call on her, sending no note of explanation, allowing the distance to stretch and harden between them while he tried to decide what he believed. During those 2 days, he found himself returning to the letter again and again, studying the careful, disguised handwriting, searching for some clue as to its author. The paper was fine, expensive, not the kind used by common gossips or idle mischief-makers. Whoever had written it had access to details that suggested genuine closeness to the Whitmore household, an intimacy with Eleanor's circumstances that troubled him even more than the accusation itself. He paced the length of his study late into the night, torn between the instinct to trust the woman who had spoken to him with such disarming honesty at that first supper, and the old, well-worn fear that honesty could be performed as easily as it could be genuine. He thought of his own history, of the years spent guarding himself against precisely this kind of uncertainty, and he despised the way the letter had so quickly reawakened doubts he had believed himself finally free of. It was not Eleanor's fault that his past had left him this way, he reminded himself. and yet knowing this did little to loosen the tight, anxious grip the accusation had taken on his thoughts. Eleanor felt the silence keenly. She had grown accustomed, in the short weeks of their acquaintance, to a kind of steady warmth from him, notes arriving with small observations about books or gardens, visits that came reliably and without pretense. The sudden absence of all of it left her unsettled, in a way she could not immediately explain, though a quiet dread began building beneath her ribs as the days passed without word. It was Lady Constance who finally told her what had happened, arriving unannounced at the Whitmore house on the third day, her expression tight with barely restrained frustration. "My nephew is behaving like a fool," she said, without preamble, once she and Eleanor were alone in the drawing room. "Someone has sent him an anonymous letter, claiming you have been secretly engaged to another man this entire time, and rather than simply asking you the truth of it, he has retreated into that miserable silence he is so fond of when he is hurt." Eleanor felt the blood drain from her face. "That is not true. There is no other man. There has never been anyone else." "I did not think there was," Lady Constance said. "But you must understand, Miss Whitmore, that Julian was betrayed once before, quite thoroughly, by a woman who claimed to love him, while quietly maintaining an understanding with another gentleman of greater fortune. It nearly broke something in him that has never fully mended. A letter like this does not simply insult him. It confirms every fear he has spent years trying to bury." "Then I must speak with him," Eleanor said, already rising. "I will not let a lie stand unanswered." "That is precisely the spirit I hope to find in you," Lady Constance said, with the first genuine warmth Eleanor had yet seen from her. "Come, I will take you to him myself." They arrived at the Ashcombe townhouse within the hour, and Eleanor was shown into Julian's study with a directness that clearly startled the household staff, unaccustomed to visitors being brought so unceremoniously into the Duke's private space. Julian stood by the window when she entered, his back to the door, and did not turn immediately when he heard her enter. "Your aunt told you," he said. "She did, and she was right to." Eleanor stepped further into the room, refusing to let the coldness of his posture frighten her into retreat. "There is no other man, Julian. There never has been. Whatever that letter claims, it is a lie, and I would very much like to know who sent it and why, because someone clearly wishes to see us kept apart." He turned to face her then, and the guarded suspicion in his eyes struck her harder than she expected. "You understand why I cannot simply take your word for it. I have been deceived before, quite thoroughly, by a woman who spoke with the same conviction you are speaking with now." "I am not her," Eleanor said, her voice steady despite the ache building in her chest. "I cannot undo whatever was done to you before I came into your life, and I will not spend my time proving myself against the memory of someone else's cruelty. But I will tell you the truth, as plainly as I know how. I have never loved anyone before you. I have never wanted anyone's attention before yours. If that is not enough for you, then perhaps this was never meant to continue. But do not accuse me of a lie without giving me the chance to answer it honestly first." For a long moment silence stretched between them, taut and uncertain. Then something in Julian's expression cracked, the careful defenses he had built over years beginning to give way beneath the plain force of her honesty. "I am sorry," he said quietly. "I should have come to you directly, rather than allowing my own fear to answer for me." "Yes," Eleanor agreed. "You should have. But I understand why you did not, now that I know what came before." He crossed the room to stand before her, close enough that she could see the exhaustion beneath his composed exterior, the toll that years of guardedness had taken on him. "Will you tell me who you believe sent the letter?" Eleanor hesitated, though she already suspected the answer. "I do not know for certain, but I can think of very few people who would benefit from seeing us separated." The thought settled uncomfortably between them, unspoken but understood. Eleanor thought of her sisters, of the sharp, anxious edge that had crept into their unkindness since Julian's attention had first turned toward her, of Louisa's cold certainty that the connection would not last, a certainty that had almost sounded, in retrospect, less like prediction and more like intention. Julian did not press her further that afternoon, though Eleanor could see the question sitting behind his eyes, waiting. Instead, he asked if she would join him for a walk in the gardens behind his townhouse, a quiet, unremarkable request that felt, after the tension of the previous days, like an offering of trust rebuilding itself slowly. They walked in near silence at first, the autumn air cool and sharp around them, fallen leaves scattered across the gravel paths. It was Julian who finally spoke, his voice quieter than she had heard it before. "When I was younger, I believed love was simple," he said. "I believed that if you were honest and steady, the person you cared for would be honest and steady in return. I learned, rather painfully, that this is not always true. My first understanding, before I inherited the title, was with a woman who claimed to care for me deeply, right up until a wealthier prospect presented itself. I did not discover the truth until I overheard her discussing the arrangement with her mother, quite plainly, as though I were nothing more than a contingency plan. "I am sorry," Eleanor said quietly. "That is a cruel thing to carry." "It taught me to be careful," he said. "Perhaps too careful. I built walls around myself that made it easier to avoid being hurt again, and in doing so, I became the man society now describes as cold and difficult. I did not entirely mind the reputation. It kept most people at a comfortable distance. But not me," Eleanor said. "No," he agreed, and something in his voice softened further. "Not you. From the moment you sat beside me at that first supper, refusing to be intimidated by my reputation or my silence, I found I did not want you to keep your distance the way everyone else did." They stopped walking near a small stone bench beneath a bare-branched tree, and Julian turned to face her fully, his expression more open than Eleanor had yet seen it. "I will find out who sent that letter," he said. "And whoever it is will learn that I do not take kindly to attempts to manipulate my affections through deception." "I believe you," Eleanor said, and found, to her own quiet relief, that she meant it entirely. "There is something else I should tell you," Julian added, after a pause. "My man of business has already begun making inquiries into the household staff who might have had access to information about my correspondence with you, and any messengers who delivered unmarked letters to my door this past week. I do not intend to let this rest quietly. Whoever attempted to separate us clearly believed they understood how deeply my past would make me doubt you. I would like to prove them wrong, thoroughly and publicly, once I have the proof of who they are. And if the proof points toward my own family?" Eleanor asked, unable to keep the worry from her voice entirely. Julian considered this carefully before answering. "Then it points there, and we will deal with that truth as plainly as we have dealt with everything else between us. I would rather know the whole shape of the difficulty now than allow it to fester in silence the way this last letter so nearly allowed it to." Eleanor nodded, grateful for his steadiness even as a quiet dread settled deeper into her chest at the thought of what such proof might reveal about her own sisters. She had spent her whole life making excuses for their unkindness, telling herself it was simply the ordinary friction of sisters raised too close together, competing for attention that never seemed to stretch far enough to cover all of them equally. But a forged letter, crafted with enough precision to nearly end her connection with Julian entirely, was not the same as an unkind word spoken in a moment of jealousy. It was calculated, it was deliberate, and it frightened her more than she wanted to admit. They returned to the townhouse as the light began to fade, and Lady Constance, watching from the drawing-room window as they walked back together, allowed herself a small, satisfied smile that she did not bother to hide when Eleanor caught sight of it. "I told him he was being a fool," Lady Constance said later, once Eleanor had rejoined her for tea while Julian saw to some correspondence. "I am glad to see he had the sense to listen, eventually, even if it took my direct interference to accomplish it. Thank you for bringing me to him," Eleanor said. "I do not think I could have borne much longer wondering what had gone wrong." "You handled yourself admirably," Lady Constance said, studying her with an approval that had clearly deepened since their first meeting. "Most young women, faced with an angry, silent duke, would have either wept or fled. You did neither. You stood your ground and made him answer for his silence instead. That is precisely the kind of steadiness this family has needed for a very long time." Eleanor flushed slightly at the praise, unused to receiving it so plainly, but allowed herself to accept it rather than deflecting the way she might once have done. "May I ask you something, my lady?" Eleanor said, setting down her teacup. "Julian mentioned that he was deceived once before, by a woman he had hoped to marry. Do you know much of what happened?" Lady Constance's expression grew thoughtful, her sharp eyes softening with old sympathy. "I knew her well enough. A pretty clever young woman, charming in the way that certain people learn to be charming when they wish to obtain something. She courted Julian's affections for the better part of a year, right up until a wealthier gentleman offered his hand instead. Julian discovered the truth only by accident, and it broke something in him that took a very long time to mend, if it has fully mended even now. That explains a great deal about his caution," Eleanor said quietly. "It does. And I will tell you honestly, Miss Whitmore, I did not expect him to open himself to anyone again so soon, if ever. Which is precisely why this letter troubled me so deeply when I learned of it. Someone understood exactly which old wound to strike, and struck it with considerable precision. That is not the work of idle gossip. That is the work of someone who wished very specifically to see the two of you separated, and who knew enough about Julian's history to accomplish it efficiently. Eleanor felt the weight of this settle over her once more, the same cold unease that had followed her since Julian had first shown her the letter. I intend to discover who is responsible, my lady. I owe Julian that much, and I owe myself the certainty of knowing the truth. I have no doubt you will, Lady Constance said, studying her with something that had, by now, settled fully into approval. You have a steadiness about you that I find rather rare, Miss Whitmore. I hope, for both your sakes, that whatever comes next does not test it too severely. That evening, as her carriage carried her home through the darkening streets, Eleanor found herself turning the events of the day over carefully in her mind. The crisis had passed, at least for now, but the unease it had exposed remained. Someone within her own circle, someone close enough to know the shape of her family's private hopes and fears, had gone to considerable trouble to plant doubt between herself and Julian. The letter had been carefully worded, precise in its details, crafted by someone who understood exactly which fears to exploit. She thought again of her sisters, of the sharp edges that had crept into their behavior since the ballroom dare that had started all of this. She thought of Louisa's cold certainty, of Margaret's calculating glances, of Charlotte's uneasy warnings that had felt, at the time, almost protective, but which now seemed to carry an undertone Eleanor had not fully examined before. She resolved to watch more carefully in the days ahead, to notice the small signs she might have previously overlooked in her eagerness to believe the best of her family. Whatever trouble was coming, and she felt certain now that this letter would not be the last of it, she intended to meet it with clearer eyes than she had allowed herself before. When she arrived home, the house was quiet, her sisters already retired for the evening. Eleanor climbed the stairs slowly, pausing outside Charlotte's door, where a thin line of candlelight still glowed beneath the gap. She considered knocking, considered asking directly whether her sister knew anything about the letter that had so nearly destroyed everything she had begun to build with Julian. But something stopped her, a reluctance to accuse without proof, a lingering hope that she was wrong about the direction her suspicions had begun to point. Instead, she continued to her own room, closed the door quietly behind her, and sat for a long while in the dark, thinking not of the danger the letter represented, but of the way Julian had looked at her in the garden, the careful unfolding of trust between two people who had each been taught, in different ways, to expect very little honesty from the world around them. Whatever came next, she thought, she would face it, and she would not face it alone. The second letter arrived a week later, and this time it was not addressed to Julian. It came to Eleanor's own family, delivered to her father under the guise of a concerned family friend, claiming that Eleanor had been secretly meeting a gentleman of poor reputation in the early morning hours, using her supposed love of solitary walks as a cover for a hidden arrangement unbecoming of a respectable young woman. It suggested, with careful, damaging precision, that her sudden favor with the Duke of Ashcombe was nothing more than an attempt to secure a wealthier match before her other entanglement became known, and ruined her prospects entirely. Eleanor's father summoned her to his study the moment the letter arrived, his face tight with a fury she had rarely seen directed at her before. He did not offer her a chair. "Explain this," he said, thrusting the letter toward her without preamble. Eleanor read it quickly, her hands beginning to tremble as she recognized the same careful cruelty of the first letter, the same precise targeting of exactly the kind of accusation most likely to cause damage. "This is a lie, father. Every word of it. I have never met any gentleman in secret. I have never had any arrangement beyond my acquaintance with Julian." "Then who would write such a thing? And why?" her father demanded. "Letters like this do not appear from nowhere, Eleanor. Someone believes there is truth enough in it to be worth the risk of writing it down. Someone believes it will hurt me and hurt my chances with the Duke," Eleanor said, forcing steadiness into her voice despite the panic rising in her chest. "That is all the truth this letter contains." Her father studied her for a long, uncomfortable moment, and Eleanor watched something calculating move behind his eyes, an expression she recognized now for what it truly was, not concern for her reputation, but concern for what her connection to Julian might mean for the family's fortunes. "I do not care whether it is true," he said finally. "I care whether the Duke believes it. If this letter reaches him before you have the chance to explain yourself, the damage may already be done." "Why does it matter so much to you, father?" Eleanor asked quietly, watching his face carefully as she spoke. "You have never before concerned yourself so closely with my prospects. Why does this connection matter more than any I have had before?" Her father's expression flickered, just briefly, with something that looked almost like guilt before it hardened again into careful composure. "Because a match with a duke does not come twice in a family's lifetime, Eleanor. Because your sisters have had their own chances, and none have secured anything nearly so advantageous. You would be foolish to let carelessness or scandal ruin what may be the finest opportunity this family has ever been offered. The word family struck Eleanor harder than she expected, its true meaning suddenly clear beneath her father's carefully chosen words. He was not speaking of her happiness at all. He was speaking of the family's fortune, of debts she was not meant to know about, of a solution he had already begun counting on, before she herself had decided what she truly wanted from her connection to Julian. "I will speak with him myself," she said finally, her voice steadier than she felt. "I will not let a lie determine what happens between us." "He will not believe it," Eleanor said, though a small, cold doubt flickered at the edge of her certainty even as she spoke the words. "He knows me well enough now to recognize a lie when he sees one." But her father's warning proved prescient. By the time Eleanor arrived at the Ashcombe townhouse the following afternoon, having sent word ahead requesting to see Julian urgently, she found his expression already guarded, already carrying the particular weight of a man who had received unwelcome information and was struggling to decide how much of it to believe. "You have heard," she said, the moment they were alone in his study. "I have received a letter, yes," he said carefully, "much like the last one, though this time addressed to your father rather than to me directly." "It is a lie, Julian. Every word of it." Eleanor stepped closer, refusing to let the careful distance in his posture discourage her. "I have never met any gentleman in secret. My morning walks are exactly what I told you they are, nothing more. Whoever is writing these letters is doing so specifically to plant doubt where none should exist, and I believe I finally understand why." Julian's expression sharpened with interest, despite his obvious effort to remain guarded. "Tell me." Eleanor hesitated only a moment before continuing. "My father has debts, Julian, significant ones, from what I overheard some weeks ago, debts he has kept carefully hidden from the rest of the family. I believe my connection to you has become, in his eyes, a solution to those debts, a fortunate match that might rescue the family's fortunes entirely. If that is true, then someone in my household may see these letters not as an attack on me, but as a means of controlling how quickly, and on what terms, this connection between us develops." "You believe your own family is behind this," Julian said quietly, understanding settling into his expression. "I do not want to believe it," Eleanor said, her voice catching slightly. "But I cannot ignore the pattern any longer. The first letter arrived just as our connection was becoming known publicly, perhaps to slow things, to ensure I did not move too quickly toward an understanding, before certain arrangements could be secured. This second letter arrived after my father learned of the extent of Lady Constance's approval, after it became clear this match was becoming a real possibility rather than a passing curiosity. I believe someone close to me is trying to manage the timing and shape of this courtship for reasons that have nothing to do with my happiness." Julian was quiet for a long moment, processing this, his gaze distant and thoughtful. "My man of business traced the messenger who delivered the first letter to a public house not far from your family's residence. He paid the boy who carried it, a street child with no loyalty beyond the coin in his pocket, who described the person who hired him only vaguely, a woman, cloaked, unwilling to give her name." "A woman," Eleanor repeated softly, the words settling heavily between them. "It does not confirm anything definitively," Julian said, "but it does not exclude the possibility you are suggesting, either." Eleanor sat down slowly in the chair near the window, her earlier composure finally cracking under the weight of what they were both circling toward without yet saying it plainly. "If it is one of my sisters, Julian, I do not know what I will do. I have spent my whole life making excuses for their unkindness, telling myself it was simply the ordinary friction between sisters who never received quite enough attention to go around. But this is not unkindness. This is deliberate harm, crafted with enough precision to nearly destroy something I have come to care for deeply." Julian crossed the room and knelt beside her chair, taking her hands in his with a gentleness that undid the last of her careful composure. "Whatever the truth turns out to be, Eleanor, I want you to understand something clearly. I do not believe these letters. I did not believe the first one, not truly, not once my fear had settled enough to let me think clearly. I certainly do not believe this second one. My uncertainty these past days has never been about you. It has been about my own difficulty trusting good things when they arrive in my life, a difficulty that belongs entirely to me and my own history, not to any failing of yours." "Thank you for saying that," Eleanor said, her voice unsteady with the relief of it. "I intend to discover the truth of who is responsible," Julian continued, "not because I doubt you, but because I will not allow this pattern to continue unanswered. If it is someone within your family, then your father will need to know the full truth of what has been done in his household, regardless of how uncomfortable that truth may prove to be. Eleanor nodded, though the thought of what confirmation might mean for her relationship with her sisters, however strained it had already become, filled her with a dread she could not entirely name. She had spent her life as the overlooked sister, the quiet one, the one who absorbed unkindness without complaint because complaining had never seemed to change anything. But this was different. This threatened not only her own happiness, but the fragile trust she and Julian had worked so carefully to rebuild after the first letter's damage. "There is something else you should know," Julian said, his voice gentler now. "My aunt has suggested hosting a small dinner at the end of this week, inviting your family along with a handful of others. She believes, and I am inclined to agree, that observing your sisters directly, in conversation, in their reactions to certain carefully placed questions, may reveal more than any amount of investigation from a distance." "You intend to test them," Eleanor said slowly. "I intend to give whoever is responsible enough rope to reveal themselves," Julian said, carefully, and without cruelty, but plainly enough that the truth cannot hide much longer behind anonymous letters and disguised handwriting. Eleanor considered this, weighing the discomfort of what such an evening might reveal against her growing need to simply know the truth, whatever shape it finally took. "Very well," she said finally. "If this is what it takes to end the uncertainty, then I will attend, and I will watch as carefully as you do." "There is one more thing," Julian added, his tone measured. "My aunt intends to seat each of your sisters separately, near guests skilled at drawing out careful conversation without appearing to pry. Lord Ashford, an old friend of the family, has agreed to raise the topic of anonymous correspondence in a general way, as though discussing a piece of gossip he heard elsewhere in town, simply to observe how each of your sisters responds." "That seems a delicate thing to manage without raising suspicion," Eleanor said. "My aunt has managed far more delicate matters than this," Julian said, the faintest trace of dry humor returning to his voice for the first time since she had arrived. "She once uncovered an entire scandal involving a stolen necklace, simply by seating the right two people beside each other at supper, and letting their own nerves undo them. I trust her instincts completely." Eleanor found herself almost smiling despite the weight of the evening, grateful for the small return of lightness between them. "Then I will trust them as well." "Good," Julian said, "because I suspect the truth, whatever it proves to be, will come out far more gently this way than through direct accusation. Your family deserves the chance to reveal itself honestly, rather than being forced into a confession under pressure." Eleanor appreciated the fairness in this, even as her stomach tightened at the thought of watching her own sisters across a dinner table, searching their every word and gesture for signs of guilt she desperately hoped she would not find. They sat together in comfortable silence for a while after that, the earlier tension between them finally easing into something steadier, something that had survived a second test, and emerged, if not unscathed, then at least intact. Eleanor found herself grateful, in a way she had not expected, for the second letter's cruelty, because it had forced a conversation between them that clarified far more than it had damaged. Julian had chosen, this time, to come to her with his doubts rather than retreating into silence, and Eleanor understood what that choice had cost him, given everything his past had taught him about the danger of trusting too quickly. As she prepared to leave that evening, Julian walked her to her carriage himself, his hand steady at her elbow, and paused before helping her inside. "Whatever this dinner reveals," he said quietly, "know that it will not change what I feel for you. I have made my peace with that much, at least." Eleanor looked up at him, at the careful vulnerability in his expression that so few people in London had ever been permitted to see, and felt something settle firmly and permanently into place within her own chest. "Nor will it change what I feel for you," she said. "Whatever comes next, we will face it honestly, together." He helped her into the carriage, and as it pulled away into the darkening street, Eleanor watched him standing there, still and solitary against the lit windows of his townhouse, and understood, with sudden and complete clarity, that whatever trouble still waited within her own family, she was no longer facing it alone. The ride home passed slowly, the city lights blurring past the carriage window as Eleanor turned the evening's revelations over in her mind. She thought of her father's careful, calculating expression, of the word family spoken with such weighted meaning, of the debts she had only ever heard whispered through a thin study wall. She thought too of her sisters, of Charlotte's uneasy warnings, of Margaret's sharp glances, of Louisa's cold certainty that had felt, each time she recalled it now, less like prediction and more like quiet intention. By the time the carriage drew up before her family's house, Eleanor had resolved to face whatever the coming dinner revealed, with the same steadiness she had shown Julian in his study, whatever the cost to the fragile peace still remaining within her own household. She climbed the front steps slowly, aware of the candlelight glowing faintly behind the drawing-room curtains, and wondered, not for the first time, which of the people waiting inside might already know far more about the letters than they had ever admitted to her. The dinner at the Ashcombe townhouse began, on the surface, as any ordinary gathering of the season might have begun, with polished silver, careful conversation, and the quiet performance of manners that governed every such evening in London society. Beneath that surface, however, Eleanor felt the tension of the evening pressing against her ribs from the moment her family's carriage arrived at the front steps. Lady Constance had arranged the seating with obvious deliberation. Margaret was placed beside Lord Ashford, a genial older gentleman known throughout the ton for his easy, disarming conversation and his habit of drawing out information from people without their quite noticing they had given it. Charlotte sat near Julian's cousin, a quiet, observant young woman named Prudence who had been asked, gently, to simply listen more than she spoke. Louisa was seated closest to Lady Constance herself, a placement that Eleanor understood, the moment she saw it, was no accident at all. When Eleanor's family had first arrived, her father had greeted Julian with an eagerness that bordered on uncomfortable, clasping his hand rather too long, and speaking with a warmth Eleanor had rarely heard him use toward anyone. Her mother had fussed over the arrangement of the drawing room, complimenting the china, the flowers, the careful placement of every candle, as though hoping her enthusiasm might somehow secure the match more firmly through sheer force of approval. Only Eleanor's sisters had remained quiet during the initial exchange of pleasantries, each of them offering polite but carefully measured greetings before taking their assigned seats at the long table. Eleanor sat beside Julian, close enough to feel the steady warmth of his presence, though neither of them spoke of the evening's true purpose as the first course was served. Instead, they spoke of ordinary things, the unusually mild autumn weather, a new exhibition recently opened at a gallery nearby, the tedious length of a recent parliamentary debate that had kept half of London's gentlemen away from their usual engagements for the better part of a week. Beneath the ordinary rhythm of the conversation, Eleanor felt Julian's hand find hers briefly beneath the edge of the table, a small, private reassurance that steadied her more than she wanted to admit. It was Lord Ashford who first steered the conversation toward more dangerous waters, his tone light and conversational as he addressed the table at large. "I heard the strangest piece of gossip this week," he said, cutting into his meal with unhurried ease. "Apparently someone in town has taken to writing anonymous letters, quite vicious ones, designed to end promising connections before they can properly develop. A dreadful business if true. I cannot imagine what kind of person finds satisfaction in such underhanded work." The table's response was immediate and varied enough that Eleanor found herself watching each of her sisters closely, cataloging every small shift in expression. Margaret's fork paused briefly over her plate before continuing, her face carefully arranged into polite interest. Charlotte's eyes flicked, just for an instant, toward Eleanor before returning to her food, a flush of color rising faintly along her throat. Charlotte, seated beside Julian's cousin Prudence, set down her fork entirely, her expression carefully composed but her eyes fixed on her plate, rather than meeting anyone else's gaze. "How awful," she murmured, "to think someone could be so cruel over another person's happiness." Prudence, watching closely as she had been asked to, noted the tremor in Charlotte's voice and filed it away carefully, though she said nothing aloud, simply nodding along with the general sentiment of the table. Louisa laughed, light and easy, though Eleanor noticed her hand tighten almost imperceptibly around the stem of her wineglass. "How dreadful," Louisa said, "though I suppose such things are inevitable when someone rises rather suddenly in society's estimation. Envy makes people do foolish things." "Indeed," Lady Constance said smoothly, her sharp eyes moving between the three sisters with unhurried attention, "though I have always found that the people cleverest at crafting such letters are rarely the ones society suspects first. It takes a certain kind of intelligence to understand exactly which fears to exploit in a given target. A dull mind could never manage it." The compliment, disguised so carefully as observation, landed precisely where Lady Constance had intended it. Louisa's chin lifted slightly, a flicker of something proud and unguarded crossing her expression, before she caught herself and smoothed it away. It was brief, barely a heartbeat, but Eleanor saw it, and beside her, she felt Julian go very still, having seen it as well. The conversation moved on, gently steered by Lord Ashford towards safer topics, but Eleanor's appetite had entirely deserted her. She excused herself shortly after, claiming a need for fresh air, and made her way toward the small terrace beyond the drawing room, where the cool evening air might steady the racing thoughts crowding her mind. She was not alone for long. Louisa followed her out only minutes later, her expression carefully neutral in the dim terrace light. "You left rather abruptly," Louisa said. "I needed air," Eleanor replied, keeping her voice even despite the pounding of her heart. The room felt rather warm. Louisa studied her for a long moment, and something in her sister's face shifted, the careful composure cracking just slightly at the edges. "You suspect me," she said finally, not quite a question. Eleanor turned to face her fully. "Should I?" The silence that followed stretched long enough that Eleanor began to wonder if Louisa would answer at all. Then, quietly, almost too quietly to hear over the distant sounds of the party continuing inside, Louisa spoke. "I did not mean for it to go so far," she said. "The first letter, I thought, would simply slow things, give Father time to properly negotiate whatever needed negotiating before you rushed headlong into an attachment neither of us understood the stakes of. I did not think it would nearly end things between you entirely." Eleanor felt something cold and sharp settle into her chest, a confirmation she had feared and half expected, yet which still struck her with the force of genuine betrayal. "You wrote them," she said. "Both of them." Louisa's composure finally broke entirely, her shoulders curling inward as though bracing against a blow. "You do not understand what it has been like, Eleanor, watching you, always the overlooked one, always the plain, quiet sister no one noticed, suddenly become the most talked-about woman in London, simply because a duke chose to sit beside you at supper. I have spent years being told I was the clever one, the sharp one, the sister who would make the most advantageous match, and then you, of all people, secured the attention of the most eligible man in the city, without even trying. So you tried to destroy it," Eleanor said, her voice trembling now with a mixture of hurt and disbelief. "You tried to take away the one good thing that had ever happened to me, simply because it happened to me instead of you." "I told myself I was protecting the family," Louisa said, though even she seemed to hear the hollowness of the excuse as she spoke it. "Father's debts are worse than you know, Eleanor. Far worse. If your connection to the Duke failed publicly, disastrously, it would ruin us all far more thoroughly than if it simply never began. I convinced myself that slowing things, controlling the pace, was a kindness in disguise. That is not the truth, and you know it," Eleanor said. "You were jealous, Louisa. You still are. And rather than face that honestly, you chose to hurt me instead." Louisa said nothing, her eyes bright with unshed tears, and for a long moment the two sisters simply stood facing each other in the cool terrace air. Years of quiet resentment and unspoken hurt finally laid bare between them. "Do you remember," Eleanor said quietly, breaking the silence herself, "when we were children, and Mother would have new gowns made for the season? Yours and Margaret's and Charlotte's were always chosen first, cut from the finest cloth, while mine were made from whatever remained, or simply remade from something one of you had already outgrown. I never resented you for that, Louisa. I understood, even as a child, that being the youngest of four meant certain things simply came to me last, if at all. I did not ask for that arrangement any more than you did," Louisa said, though her voice had lost its earlier sharpness. "No," Eleanor agreed, "but you never once objected to it either, not when it worked in your favor, and I think, somewhere along the way, you convinced yourself that my quietness meant I did not notice, or did not mind, when in truth I noticed everything. I simply learned it was easier to stay silent than to fight for a place in this family that never seemed inclined to make room for me." Louisa's composure cracked further at this, a single tear finally slipping free despite her evident effort to hold it back. "I am not proud of what I did, Eleanor. I want you to know that, whatever else you believe of me tonight, I have lain awake more nights than I can count since sending that first letter, wondering if I had gone too far, wondering if I even recognized myself anymore." "Then why did you send the second one?" Eleanor asked, unable to keep the hurt from sharpening her voice again. "Because I was frightened," Louisa admitted. "Frightened that if the first letter failed to slow things, everything would move forward too quickly for Father to properly secure whatever arrangement he needed. And frightened, if I am honest, that watching you succeed where I had always been told I would succeed first, was more than I could bear gracefully. I am not telling you this to excuse it. I am telling you because you deserve the truth, all of it, even the parts of me I am ashamed to admit exist." It was Julian's voice, quiet but unmistakably present, that broke the silence. "I believe you owe your sister a great deal more than an excuse, Miss Louisa." Both women turned to find him standing in the doorway, his expression carefully composed but his eyes hard with a coldness Eleanor had not seen directed at anyone since that first evening she had watched him from across a crowded ballroom. Behind him, Lady Constance and Lord Ashford stood as well, having clearly followed close enough to hear the confession unfold. Louisa's face drained of color entirely. Your Grace, I do not require an explanation, Julian said, his voice even but carrying an unmistakable weight of finality. I require only that you understand the damage you have caused, not simply to my own peace of mind, but to your sister's happiness, which you attempted to sacrifice for reasons that had nothing to do with her well-being and everything to do with your own resentment. Please, Louisa said, her voice breaking now entirely, please do not tell my father. He will never forgive me. He has staked so much on this match, and if he learns I nearly destroyed it. That is a consequence you should have considered before you sent the first letter, Julian said, though something in his tone gentled slightly, some old understanding of his own past mistakes tempering his anger. I will not humiliate you publicly for this. That is not the kind of justice I am interested in delivering. But your sister deserves an honest apology, and your family deserves to know the truth of what has happened within their own household, whatever the consequences of that truth may be. Eleanor watched her sister crumble under the weight of exposure and found, to her own surprise, that her anger had already begun softening into something closer to exhausted sadness. She thought of all the years the three of them had spent competing for attention that never seemed to stretch far enough, of a household that had taught its daughters to see each other as rivals rather than allies, and understood, with sudden clarity, that Louisa's cruelty had grown from the same soil that had made Eleanor herself feel invisible for so long. I am not going to forgive you tonight, Eleanor said quietly, turning back to face her sister directly. I do not think I can, not yet, but I do not wish to see you humiliated before Father either, Louisa, not because you have earned my mercy, but because I am tired of this family destroying itself from within, instead of supporting each other honestly. Louisa stared at her, clearly stunned by the offer of restraint where she had expected only condemnation. Why would you protect me, after everything I have done? Because I do not want to become the kind of person who repays cruelty with cruelty, Eleanor said. I have spent enough of my life being made small by this family. I do not intend to spend the rest of it making others small in return. The dinner concluded quietly after that, the earlier tension dissolving into something more subdued and uncertain. Eleanor's father, informed privately by Julian of the general shape of what had occurred, though not the full details Eleanor had asked be kept between the two of them, grew unusually silent for the remainder of the evening, his earlier eagerness for the match tempered now by an evident shame at what his own household had nearly done to secure it. Before the family departed, he drew Eleanor aside briefly, his usual composure noticeably shaken. I did not know, he said quietly. Whatever Louisa has done, I did not ask it of her, nor would I have condoned it had I known. I believe you, Father, Eleanor said, though a small, tired part of her wondered how much of his surprise stemmed from genuine ignorance, and how much from simple relief that the scheme had not been traced back to his own desperate encouragement of the match. She did not voice this doubt aloud. The evening had already carried enough difficult truths for one night, and she found she had little appetite left for further confrontation. I have not always given you the attention you deserved, her father continued, the admission clearly costing him something significant to speak aloud. I see that more clearly tonight than I have in a long while. Eleanor said nothing to this, uncertain whether the moment called for forgiveness she was not yet ready to offer, or simply silence that allowed the words to exist without demanding more from her than she had left to give. She simply nodded and allowed him to hand her into the waiting carriage, where her sisters sat in a silence far heavier than any that had passed between them before. As the Whitmore family's carriage prepared to depart, Julian walked Eleanor to the door himself, drawing her slightly aside from the rest of her family, under the pretense of a final word of thanks for her attendance. You handled that with more grace than I could have managed at your age, he said quietly. I am not certain I would have shown Louisa the same mercy had our situations been reversed. I am not entirely certain I showed her mercy for her sake, Eleanor admitted. I think I showed it for my own. I did not want tonight to end in humiliation and shouting. I wanted it to end in truth, however uncomfortable that truth proved to be. Julian studied her for a long moment, something warm and unguarded settling into his expression. There is something I have been meaning to ask you, he said, though I had intended to wait until circumstances were rather less complicated than they currently are. Eleanor's heart quickened. What is it? Not tonight, he said, with the faintest hint of a smile. Tonight has carried enough weight already. But soon, Eleanor, very soon. She left that evening with her sister's confession still heavy in her chest, with the uncertain future of her family's fragile peace still unresolved, and yet beneath all of it, a quiet, steady warmth remained, the growing certainty that whatever came next, she would not face it as the overlooked, invisible sister she had once believed herself to be. She would face it as herself, fully seen at last, by the one person whose seeing had come to matter more than any others. 3 weeks passed before Julian asked her the question he had promised, and in that time, Eleanor felt her world settling into a shape she had never quite dared to imagine for herself. Her relationship with Louisa remained careful and unresolved, neither fully mended nor entirely broken, the two sisters navigating a new, cautious honesty that had replaced the old, comfortable distance between them. Louisa had apologized properly, in private, without an audience to witness her humility, and Eleanor had accepted the apology without yet offering full forgiveness, understanding that trust, once damaged so deliberately, could not be rebuilt in a single conversation. Charlotte and Margaret, learning gradually of what had happened, had each responded in their own ways. Charlotte with quiet guilt for warnings she now understood had come from a place of complicated protectiveness rather than pure concern. Margaret with a wary new respect for a sister she had spent years underestimating. Eleanor's father, too, had begun treating her differently, though the change carried an uncomfortable undertone she could not entirely ignore. His warmth toward her felt, at times, less like genuine affection, and more like careful investment in an asset he did not wish to see damaged. She did not confront him directly about this suspicion, choosing instead to hold it quietly at a distance, aware that whatever happened next in her life would happen on her own terms, regardless of what her family hoped to gain from it. Julian, meanwhile, had become a steady, constant presence in her days, calling on her regularly, walking with her in the mornings she so loved, introducing her gradually to more of his own small circle of trusted friends and family. Lady Constance had taken to referring to Eleanor as though her place in the family were already settled, a habit that made Eleanor's heart quicken with hope each time she heard it, though she was careful not to assume too much before Julian himself had spoken plainly. Society, too, had shifted its opinion of her considerably in those weeks. Where once she had passed through crowded rooms entirely unnoticed, she now found herself the subject of careful attention wherever she went. Hostesses competing to secure her presence at their gatherings, young women who had once overlooked her entirely, now seeking her friendship with an eagerness that felt, at times, faintly absurd, given how little had actually changed about her own character in the months since that first dare. She remained, at heart, the same quiet, thoughtful woman who preferred solitary morning walks to crowded ballrooms, and she found a certain wry amusement in watching how quickly the world's opinion of her had transformed simply because a duke had chosen to notice what had always been there. She spoke of this once to Lady Constance, during one of their now regular teas together, and the older woman had laughed, a short, knowing sound. "That is the way of society, my dear. It rarely values what is genuinely good until someone of sufficient standing points toward it and declares it valuable. You must not let their sudden attention convince you that you were ever truly lacking before. You were simply waiting for the right eyes to see you clearly." Eleanor had turned the words over carefully in the days that followed, finding in them a comfort she had not expected, a reminder that whatever society now believed of her, the steadiness and quiet courage that had first carried her across that ballroom had been present in her all along, waiting patiently for someone willing to look closely enough to notice. He finally did so on a crisp morning in late autumn, during one of their customary early walks through the small garden behind his townhouse, the same garden where he had first admitted his old wounds to her weeks earlier. The leaves had turned fully now, scattered in gold and copper across the gravel paths, and the air carried the particular sharp clarity of the season's turning. Julian stopped walking near the same stone bench where they had once spoken of his broken engagement, and Eleanor felt her heart begin to race even before he spoke, some instinct already understanding what was coming. "I have thought a great deal," he said, "about what I want to say to you this morning, and I find that every carefully composed speech I attempted falls apart the moment I try to speak it aloud. So I will simply tell you plainly, in the way you have always been honest with me." Eleanor waited, her breath caught somewhere between hope and nervous anticipation. "You sat beside me at a supper table you had every reason to avoid," Julian continued, "not because you wanted anything from me, not because you sought advantage or connection, but because you refused to let fear decide your actions. In every difficulty since, every letter, every doubt, every painful revelation about your own family, you have met each trial with the same steady honesty. You have never once asked me to be anyone other than exactly who I am, difficult reputation and all, and you have never allowed anyone, including myself, to make you feel smaller than you are." He reached for her hands, holding them gently between his own. "I spent years believing I would never again trust anyone enough to offer them my whole heart. I built walls I was certain no one would ever manage to climb. And then you sat down beside me, refusing to be intimidated, refusing to flatter me or flee from me, and somehow, without my quite noticing how it happened, You climbed every wall I had built without even trying. Eleanor felt tears gathering, unbidden, at the corners of her eyes. Julian, let me finish, he said, with the faintest, warm smile. I am asking you, Eleanor Whitmore, to marry me. Not because it would resolve your family's difficulties, though I understand it may. Not because it would satisfy society's expectations of a duke's eventual marriage, though I imagine it will do that as well. I am asking because I cannot imagine continuing this life without you steady beside me, seeing me plainly, honestly, exactly as I am, the way no one else in my life ever has. Eleanor's answer came without hesitation, the words rising easily from someplace deep and certain within her. Yes, she said. Yes, Julian, I will marry you. He kissed her then, gently, there among the fallen autumn leaves, and Eleanor felt, for the first time in her entire life, entirely and completely seen, not as the overlooked sister, not as a solution to her family's financial troubles, not as a curiosity that society would forget by season's end, but as herself, fully and finally. The news spread through London with the same rapid, breathless speed as that first dance had done months earlier, though this time the whispers carried a different quality entirely, less scandal and curiosity, more genuine astonishment at the transformation society had witnessed unfold before their eyes. The overlooked Whitmore sister, once dismissed as plain and unremarkable, was to become Duchess of Ashcombe, having secured the affections of the most feared and guarded man in the city through nothing more than steady, unflinching honesty. Eleanor's family received the news with varying degrees of genuine joy and complicated relief. Her mother wept openly, already planning a wedding grand enough to secure the family's social standing for years to come. Her father's relief at the family's rescued fortunes was evident despite his attempts to disguise it as simple paternal happiness, though Eleanor found she could extend him more patience now than she might have weeks earlier, understanding that his flaws, however real, did not erase whatever genuine affection existed beneath them. Margaret and Charlotte offered their congratulations with what appeared to be sincere warmth. The earlier competition and unkindness of the season's beginning softened considerably by everything the family had endured together in recent weeks. Louisa's congratulations came quietly, privately, accompanied by a small, carefully chosen gift, a book of poetry not unlike the one Julian had once given Eleanor, a gesture that felt, though neither sister spoke of it directly, like the beginning of something that might eventually become genuine reconciliation. The wedding itself, held in the early winter as the first snow began dusting London's rooftops, became the talk of the entire season, exactly as everyone had predicted it would. The church filled with more guests than it had space to comfortably hold, curious to witness the union between the city's most feared duke and the sister everyone had once overlooked entirely. Lady Constance sat in the front pew, dressed in deep burgundy silk, her expression carrying an unmistakable pride that softened her usually sharp features into something unmistakably warm. In the days leading up to the ceremony, Eleanor had found herself surprised by how little anxiety she carried about the event itself, despite the enormous attention it had drawn from every corner of London society. She had expected to feel overwhelmed, perhaps even fearful, standing at the center of so much public scrutiny after a lifetime spent avoiding notice entirely. Instead, she felt only a quiet, settled certainty, the kind that came from knowing precisely who waited for her at the end of the aisle, and precisely what their union had already survived to arrive at this moment. Her mother had fussed endlessly over every detail, from the exact shade of ribbon trimming Eleanor's gown, to the precise arrangement of winter roses decorating the church entrance, and Eleanor had allowed her that indulgence gladly, understanding it as her mother's own way of participating in a joy she had not always known how to express directly to her quieter daughter. Her father, too, seemed genuinely moved as he walked her down the aisle, his earlier calculating relief finally giving way, in that particular moment, to something that looked remarkably like simple paternal pride. Eleanor walked down the aisle in a gown of soft ivory, simple in its elegance rather than ostentatious, exactly the kind of dress she would have chosen for herself rather than one selected to impress society's watching eyes. Julian waited for her at the altar, and when their eyes met across the length of the church, Eleanor felt every lingering doubt, every old wound of invisibility and dismissal, finally settle into quiet, permanent peace. Their vows were simple and unadorned, spoken plainly in the manner that had come to define their entire courtship. Julian's voice did not waver as he promised to see her clearly, always, exactly as she was, without demanding she become smaller or quieter to fit anyone else's expectations. Eleanor's own promise carried the same steady honesty, a vow to meet whatever difficulties life presented them with the same unflinching courage that had first carried her across a crowded ballroom toward a chair no one else had dared to sit in. As the officiant pronounced them husband and wife, a quiet murmur of genuine warmth moved through the crowded church, entirely different from the curious whispers that had followed Eleanor throughout the earlier months of her courtship. This was not the sound of society marveling at an unexpected match, but something gentler, an audience genuinely moved by the evident devotion between the two people standing at the altar. Even Margaret, seated near the front with Charlotte, dabbed quietly at her eyes with a handkerchief. The old rivalries of the season finally softened into something like genuine affection for her youngest sister's happiness. Julian took Eleanor's hands in his own as the final blessing was spoken, and in that moment, surrounded by every layer of London society that had once dismissed her entirely, Eleanor felt not the anxious self-consciousness she might once have expected, but a settled, quiet joy that asked nothing further of the watching crowd. She had spent so many years believing her worth depended on being noticed, on securing a place within rooms that had never quite made space for her. Standing now beside Julian, she understood at last that true belonging had never required an audience at all, only the steady, honest regard of the one person willing to see her fully. After the ceremony, as the wedding breakfast unfolded in the grand hall of the Ashcombe townhouse, Eleanor found herself standing near a window overlooking the snow-dusted garden, watching the celebration continue around her with a quiet sense of wonder that had not yet fully faded. Louisa approached her there, hesitant in a way Eleanor had rarely seen from her sharp-tongued sister. "I am truly happy for you," Louisa said. "I know that may be difficult to believe, given everything, but it is true." "I believe you," Eleanor said, and found, to her own surprise, that she genuinely meant it. "We have both changed a great deal these past months, Louisa. Perhaps that is the one good thing to come from everything that happened. Do you think we might, in time, become the kind of sisters we should have been all along?" Louisa asked, uncertainty softening her usually confident voice. Eleanor considered this carefully before answering, unwilling to offer false reassurance, simply to smooth over a moment made uncomfortable by honesty. "I think it is possible," she said finally. "I do not think it will happen quickly, or without effort from both of us. But I would like to try, if you are willing to try as well." Louisa nodded, something genuine and hopeful crossing her expression for the first time since the terrace confession that had finally brought their old resentments into the open air. "I would like that very much." Julian found Eleanor shortly after, drawing her gently away from the crowded hall toward a quiet corridor where they might steal a private moment amid the celebration. He studied her carefully, noting the thoughtful expression still lingering from her conversation with Louisa. "You are thinking of something serious for a woman on her wedding day," he observed, with the faint, warm humor that had become so familiar to her. "I am thinking of everything that led us here," Eleanor said. "A dare I nearly refused, letters that nearly destroyed everything before it properly began, a sister's jealousy finally laid bare, a family forced to confront truths it had long avoided. It seems strange that so much difficulty led to something this good." "Perhaps that is simply how the most lasting things are built," Julian said, drawing her closer. "Not through ease, but through difficulty faced honestly, together, until what remains has been tested thoroughly enough to trust completely." Eleanor leaned into him, feeling the steady, familiar warmth of his presence settle around her like something permanent and certain. "I am glad I sat down in that chair," she said quietly. "Whatever else came from it, however difficult the path proved to be, I am glad I did not let fear decide that moment for me." "So am I," Julian said, pressing a gentle kiss to her forehead. "More glad than I have words to properly express." They returned to the celebration together, hand in hand, no longer the feared Duke and his overlooked, dismissed acquaintance, but a Duke and Duchess who had built something real and lasting from the wreckage of old fears and unexpected courage. Eleanor Whitmore, once invisible in her own family's eyes, stood now fully seen, fully valued, exactly as herself, beside a man who had learned, through her steady honesty, that trust, however carefully guarded, could still be rebuilt when the right person finally arrived to earn it. Outside, the snow continued falling gently over London's rooftops, soft and quiet and endless, much like the steady, unshakable love that had grown between them from that first defiant dare in a crowded ballroom to this final, certain moment of belonging neither of them had ever truly expected to find. Years later, when their own children asked how their parents had first met, Eleanor would tell the story simply, without embellishment, exactly as it had happened. She would speak of a dare thrown carelessly by sisters who never imagined it would lead anywhere significant. of an empty chair beside a man the whole room had been too frightened to approach, of the quiet courage it had taken to sit down anyway. She would tell them that sometimes the bravest thing a person could do was refuse to let fear, or the low expectations of others, decide who they were allowed to become. And always, at the end of the story, Julian would take her hand exactly as he had on that snow-dusted wedding day, and remind their children that their mother had never once needed to change herself to be worthy of love. She had simply needed someone willing to look closely enough to see the worth that had been there all along, waiting patiently in the quietest corner of every crowded room she had ever entered. Spring arrived early the following year, and with it came an invitation Eleanor had not expected, one that would test the fragile new peace her family had built in the months since her wedding. Her father wrote requesting a private meeting, not with Julian, but with Eleanor alone, a request unusual enough that she read the letter twice before agreeing to it. She arrived at her childhood home on a mild afternoon, the garden beginning to show the first green signs of the changing season, and found her father waiting for her in his study, looking older and more uncertain than she remembered him appearing even during the most difficult weeks of her courtship. "I have settled the debts," he said, without preamble, once she was seated across from him. "Entirely. I wished you to know that before I said anything further, because I understand you have had cause, these past months, to wonder whether my affection for you has ever been separate from what your marriage has provided this family." Eleanor said nothing at first, allowing the admission to settle between them honestly, rather than rushing to fill the silence with reassurance she did not yet feel prepared to offer. "I am not proud of how I behaved," her father continued. "I allowed my fear over this family's finances to color nearly everything I said and did during those weeks, and I did not consider carefully enough what that pressure might have driven your sister to attempt. I have spent a great deal of time since reflecting on the kind of father I wish to have been to all 4 of my daughters, rather than the kind of father circumstance and worry pushed me into becoming. Thank you for telling me this," Eleanor said carefully. "I will not pretend it does not matter to me, hearing it, but I think trust, once shaken as thoroughly as it was shaken between us, takes longer to rebuild than a single conversation, however honest." "I understand that," her father said, and something in his weathered expression suggested he genuinely did. "I do not ask for your trust today. I only wished you to know that whatever value I placed on your marriage in those difficult weeks, the value I place on you as my daughter has never depended on it, even when my actions failed to show that clearly." They spoke for a while longer, carefully, honestly, in a manner Eleanor could not recall ever having managed with her father before, and when she finally rose to leave, she felt something loosen in her chest that had remained tightly wound since the night of Louisa's confession on the terrace. Before she departed, her father added one final thing, his voice quieter than before. "Your mother tells me you have taken to visiting the small parish school near your new home, teaching some of the younger children their letters on afternoons, when Julian is occupied with estate matters. She says you seem happier there than at half the grand gatherings society insists on hosting." Eleanor smiled, surprised her mother had noticed and mentioned such a small, private detail of her new life. "I find I enjoy it a great deal. There is something honest about teaching a child to read, something that asks nothing of me beyond patience and genuine attention. It reminds me, oddly enough, of how Julian first spoke to me, as though what I had to offer mattered simply because I offered it honestly." Her father nodded slowly, something like genuine understanding settling into his tired features. "Your mother was the same once, before the weight of managing this household and its finances wore some of that gentleness away. I am glad you have found a way to keep it." The observation stayed with Eleanor long after she had returned home, a small, unexpected gift from a father she had spent so many years believing, incapable of truly seeing her. The following week brought a different kind of visit entirely, when Louisa arrived unannounced at Eleanor's new home, carrying a small, carefully wrapped parcel and an expression of nervous determination that Eleanor had come to recognize as her sister's particular way of approaching difficult conversations. "I have been offered a position," Louisa said, once they were seated together in the drawing room, "as a companion to an elderly relative of Lord Ashford's, living some distance outside London. I intend to accept it." Eleanor studied her sister carefully, surprised by the announcement. "That seems a significant change from the life you have known here." "It is," Louisa agreed, "but I find I no longer wish to remain in a city where every room I enter reminds me of what I nearly destroyed. I need distance, Eleanor, not to escape the consequences of what I did, but to become someone I can be proud of again, away from the old patterns this family seems so determined to repeat." "I think that sounds wise," Eleanor said gently. "Though I will miss you, whatever difficulty remains unresolved between us." Louisa's eyes softened. genuine emotion breaking through her usual careful composure. "I hoped you might say that. I have brought you something, before I leave." She handed over the small parcel, and Eleanor unwrapped it carefully to find a delicate, hand-embroidered handkerchief, stitched with small, careful flowers along its border. "I made it myself," Louisa admitted, a faint flush rising in her cheeks. "It is not much, given everything, but I wanted to give you something made with my own hands rather than simply purchased, something that took time and care rather than convenience." Eleanor traced the careful stitching with genuine appreciation, touched by the evident effort behind the gift. "It is lovely, Louisa." "Thank you. I know an apology cannot undo what I did," Louisa said quietly. "But I hope, in time, distance and honest effort might accomplish what words alone could not." "I hope so too," Eleanor said, and found, saying it aloud, that she meant the sentiment more fully than she had expected to. Louisa departed for her new position within the fortnight, and the house felt strangely quieter in her absence, though Eleanor found herself writing to her sister regularly in the weeks that followed, careful letters exchanging small details of daily life, gradually rebuilding, correspondence by correspondence, a relationship that had nearly been destroyed entirely by jealousy and fear. Meanwhile, Eleanor's own life alongside Julian continued to deepen in ways that surprised her even after months of marriage. She had expected, perhaps, that the early intensity of their courtship might settle into something more ordinary once the drama of anonymous letters and family scandal had finally faded. Instead, she found their daily life together carried its own quiet richness, mornings spent walking together through gardens that had become as familiar to her now as her childhood home, evenings spent in comfortable conversation that never seemed to run short of subjects worth discussing. Lady Constance remained a constant, welcome presence in their household, her sharp wit softening gradually into something warmer whenever Eleanor was near, though she never entirely lost the directness that had first endeared her to Eleanor during that early musical evening. She had taken to calling Eleanor "my dear girl" rather than the more formal address she had once used, a small shift that Eleanor treasured more than any grander display of affection could have managed. The two women had grown close enough, in the months since the wedding, that Lady Constance had begun sharing stories of Julian's childhood, small, precious details Eleanor had never known, of a boy who had once collected pressed flowers from the very garden where he now walked each morning, of a quiet, thoughtful child who had loved books long before grief and betrayal taught him to guard himself so carefully against the world. Hearing these stories filled in pieces of Julian that even his own careful honesty had never fully revealed, and Eleanor found herself grateful, again and again, for the older woman's willingness to share them. "He was always tender-hearted, underneath everything," Lady Constance told her once, over their customary afternoon tea. "Society decided long ago that he was cold, and he let them believe it, because it was easier than explaining a grief they would never have taken the trouble to understand properly. You are the first person in years who bothered to look past what he allowed the world to see." One evening in early summer, as Eleanor and Julian sat together in the quiet garden behind their townhouse, watching the last light of day fade slowly over the rooftops, Julian turned to her with an expression she had come to recognize as the particular thoughtfulness he carried before sharing something important. "I have been thinking," he said, "about the evening we first met, about how close I came to never speaking to you at all, had you not possessed the courage to sit down beside me despite every reason not to. I think about that evening often as well," Eleanor admitted. "It seems strange now how much depended on a single dare thrown carelessly by sisters who never imagined it would lead anywhere significant. I do not think it was carelessness alone that led you to that chair," Julian said. "I think something in you had simply grown tired of being overlooked, and was waiting for the right moment to prove it. The dare was only the occasion. The courage was entirely your own." Eleanor considered this, watching the last golden light settle over the garden they had come to share so completely. "Perhaps you are right. I do not think I fully understood, at the time, how much that single choice would change. I only knew I was tired of shrinking myself to fit the small space my family had always allowed me." "I am endlessly grateful you made that choice," Julian said, drawing her closer against the cooling evening air. "Whatever difficulty followed, whatever trials our beginning demanded of us both, I would not trade a single moment of it, knowing it led us here." They sat together in comfortable silence as the garden darkened fully around them, the quiet, steady contentment between them, carrying none of the anxious uncertainty that had marked so much of their early courtship. Eleanor thought of the long journey that had brought her to this particular evening, from an overlooked girl standing at the edges of every room, to a woman fully seen, fully valued, settled securely into a life built on honesty rather than performance. on genuine partnership rather than convenient arrangement. Whatever challenges still waited ahead, whether from her family's continuing efforts to rebuild what had nearly been lost, or simply the ordinary difficulties any life together eventually presented, Eleanor faced them now with a steadiness that no longer depended on anyone else's approval or attention. She had learned through every trial of that first difficult season that her own worth had never actually been in question. It had simply been waiting, patiently and quietly, for someone willing to look closely enough to finally see it clearly.